Saddam Hussein, Adolf Hitler, Oprah Winfrey. These are dictators we've all heard of, but some dictators have flown under the radar, so I thought I'd make a video on dictators you've never heard of. Now, my subscribers are very intelligent. You're not like the idiots who subscribe to Watch Mojo, or the creeps who watch Top 10s, so you might have heard of some of these dictators, but I'm sticking with the video title anyway. I like it. This man has a name I can't pronounce. I've tried and failed. Luckily, he's also known as the Stalin of Mongolia. Like Stalin, he crafted a huge cult of personality and arranged the mass purges of his rivals. He also had a lot of medals. I mean, look at him here. The man was a stud. Until 1921, Mongolia was part of China, but then the Mongolian Communist Party led a revolution with the help of the Soviet Union. He rose to power in the chaos that followed. In 1939, he gained absolute power and kept it by modeling himself on Joseph Stalin, but he eventually fell out with Stalin. His dream was always to unite the lands traditionally seen as Mongolia, but as some of that land was in Russia and China, Stalin refused to support this ambition and they stopped being friends. Since his death in 1952, no one person has had full control of Mongolia. Robert Mugabe was dictator of Zimbabwe until just last year, but before him was Ian Smith, a man with the appearance and name of a history teacher. He ruled from 1964 to 1979. Smith established an apartheid system, much like the one in South Africa, but this caused uprising by black militant groups. The militants were backed by communist countries, and after 15 years of war, Smith was getting desperate. His government was isolated and had no relations with most other countries. In fact, the UN urged other nations not to recognize the regime, calling it too racist. That was in 1965. If you're considered too racist in 1965, something has gone very wrong. Eventually, Ian Smith agreed to share power with Robert Mugabe, seeing him as a safer and more peaceful option than the militant groups. This enabled Mugabe to then seize absolute control of the country. Ian Smith would spend the rest of his life complaining about Mugabe, as if he played no part in Mugabe's rise to power. So if nothing else, Ian Smith was quite funny. Türkmenbasy was the ruler of Turkmenistan until his death in 2006. He might not have been as sexy as Kim Jong-un, but he was just as crazy. He renamed the month of April after his mother, as well as the word for bread, meaning millions of people ate his mother on a daily basis. He didn't want people reading any books other than the Quran and the book he wrote, so he shut down libraries across the country. In fact, he renamed the month September after his book. He had an ice rink built in the desert, as well as a golden statue of himself that slowly rotates, so that it always faces the sun. He outlawed ballet and opera, which to be honest I'm in support of. He did so many weird things I'm struggling over which ones I should include here. He didn't like dogs, so he banned them from the capital city, something I imagine was hard to enforce. François Duvalier was dictator of Haiti from 1957 to 71. It was during this time Haiti became the world's poorest country. Duvalier was a greedy tyrant, sucking his country of wealth so that he could live in luxury, while others knew only misery. But it was okay because he was also hilarious. A superstitious man, at one point he believed a political opponent of his had transformed himself into a black dog. So Duvalier ordered the extermination of all black dogs in Haiti. He was a practitioner of voodoo and declared himself to be a god. But he was the most cowardly god ever, only feeling safe to leave his palace one day of each month, the 22nd. For some reason he believed there was something magical about the number 22, and most other days he lived as a recluse, shut away in the palace. Jorge Videla was the president of Argentina until 1981. He ran a military dictatorship, and honestly, he seems like a fictional dictator from an old comedy film. as well as making thousands of political opponents disappear and protecting Nazi war criminals. He systematically kidnapped babies. In fact, he was eventually given 50 years in prison for kidnapping babies. His regime was also notorious for its execution methods, sometimes throwing people out of helicopters into the ocean. Thankfully, his government would soon collapse. This came after Argentina lost the Falklands War. People lost confidence in the military, and as it was a military dictatorship, his regime was doomed. He and other military leaders were famously put on trial in 1985. Videla died in prison 28 years later. What a prick. Equatorial Guinea is an interesting place, being the only African country to speak Spanish. For about 10 years it was ruled by a lunatic called Fransisco Nguema. As the dying Spanish Empire gave up control of the country, they installed him as ruler, hoping he would be sympathetic to them, but he was too crazy for that. Instead, he encouraged vigilante mobs to attack any Spanish people who remained. He also killed or exiled 1/3 of all people in the country. Many died in forced labour ordered by him, or starved to death as he mismanaged the economy. He shut down the country's central bank, and kept much of the money he found there under his bed. He even abolished education. Nguema was such a crazy dick that his own nephew deposed him. This man doesn't seem like a dictator. He looks like the jolly owner of a takeaway restaurant in northern England. But no, he was the dictator of Burma, who had over 1 million people sent to brutal prison camps. He's called Shwe and he's insane, often making decisions based on the advice of soothsayers and fortune tellers. So things got pretty wild in Burma during his rule, which lasted between 1992 and 2011, when he for some reason stepped down, probably on the advice of a fortune teller. He's 85 now, or 83, it's unclear how old he really is, and he just lives in Burma as a kind of retired dictator. Porfirio Diaz ruled Mexico for 35 years. He was a general who took power in 1884 with a military coup. Diaz wanted to lift Mexico out of poverty, allowing foreigners to buy land and institutions. American investors bought so much Mexican land that Diaz came to be known as the man who sold Mexico. This didn't go down well, as the wealth of his supporters grew and others continued to starve. The government grew less popular until the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution in 1910. Within the year, he was forced to resign by rebels supported by America, which is strange as he was like a doormat for American interest. But that was just the start of the revolution. It would last another 9 years. That's one of the reasons Mexico remains neutral in World War I. 40 years ago, Jean-Bedel Bokassa was declared Emperor of the Central African Republic, despite it not actually being an empire. He had a cartoonishly large throne built, and was crowned in a ceremony modelled on Napoleon's coronation. The ceremony cost the entire country's GDP for that year. From then on, he would be known as Emperor Bokassa, but before that he was known as the Cannibal Dictator. Throughout his 13 years in power, there were rumours of him cannibalising the flesh of his dead political opponents. It's unclear if this is true, but we know he had 100 schoolchildren executed because he didn't like their uniforms. Bokassa was eventually overthrown by a French intervention in 1979. Imagine being too crazy for the French. Ferdinand Marcos ruled the Philippines from 1965 to 86. He did this by claiming the country was under threat from communist rebels, and declared martial law. He then simply refused to step down as president. Marcos' opponents were tortured and executed regularly. It was largely overlooked, but when his main political opponent was mysteriously killed, it sparked a revolution that forced Marcos to flee the country. It was a non-violent revolution, but still Marcos ran away to Hawaii, which is where I'd go if I were an exiled dictator. He died 2 years later, but his wife is still alive, as is their son, Bong Bong. They've really called their son Bong Bong, and that's not even the most ridiculous thing they did. At one point they almost accidentally killed the Beatles. It was 1966 and the Beatles had just arrived in the Philippines. Ferdinand's wife really wanted to meet them, but tired from a long flight, they snubbed her. This was a mistake. The security guards protecting them mysteriously disappeared, and when word got out they had insulted the First Lady, angry mobs descended on the group. They were forced to flee the country and were subsequently banned from entering it.